Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When I think back on those years, it's not just the struggle that sticks with me, it's the hope I had before I knew better. The kind of innocent belief you carry before life shows you just how sharp disappointment can be when it comes dressed in the faces of the people you trust the most. I was 17 when I started filling out college applications, my fingers trembling over keyboards late into the night, running on caffeine and the foolish idea that if you worked hard enough, the world would eventually meet you halfway. I wasn't looking for a miracle, just a chance. One decent school, one solid degree, one clean break from the small-town walls that had always felt too tight around me. I applied to 5 schools, nothing fancy, nothing out of reach, just solid state universities with good reputations and affordable tuition. I got into 4 of them, and I remember the way my heart pounded when I opened each acceptance letter, like the world was finally opening a door that I had spent years knocking on with bloody knuckles. I remember the smile on my face when I ran downstairs holding the letters, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was a moment we could all celebrate together. But celebration wasn't what I got. Instead, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table a week later, their expressions already rehearsed, their words polished to sound reasonable instead of cruel. My dad spoke first, tapping his fingers against the chipped edge of the formica like he couldn't quite look me in the eye. He said things were tight. He said they'd reviewed their finances. He said they were proud of me, really, truly proud, but they just couldn't afford to help with tuition. My mother nodded along, her tone softer but no less firm. "You're smart, Emily," she said, with that patronizing little smile she always wore when she thought she was being comforting. "You'll figure it out. You always do." And just like that, the door that had been cracked open slammed shut in my face. I didn't cry in front of them. I just nodded, swallowed the lump rising in my throat, and thanked them for their honesty. I told them I understood, because I did. Or at least I thought I did at the time. I told myself it was just bad timing, that the economy was rough, that maybe they'd help later if things got better. I told myself not to be bitter, not to let disappointment turn into something heavier. But deep down, something shifted inside me that day, something small, something silent, but something that would grow louder with every sleepless night and every unpaid bill that came afterward. I deferred my top choice and enrolled in the cheapest option I could find. I worked 2 jobs, one at a greasy diner where the smell of fryer oil never really left my clothes, and one stocking shelves overnight at a discount store where the fluorescent lights never dimmed and the managers treated you like you were replaceable before you even finished your shift. I studied in the hours between shifts, on my lunch breaks, and in the back corners of libraries with stale coffee and bags under my eyes so dark they looked like bruises. I took out loans that I still feel like I'm paying for in more ways than one. I didn't party, didn't travel, didn't have time for clubs or dating or any of the things people say make college worthwhile. I just worked, studied, and survived. I didn't blame my parents, not then at least. I told myself they were doing their best, that life had just thrown them too many curveballs. I kept showing up to family dinners, kept smiling at Jason's stories, kept pretending I was okay because that's what you do when you're raised to believe that silence is more polite than truth. And then, one evening, just 3 months after I had scraped together enough to pay my spring tuition, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Jason was in the living room, grinning from ear to ear, showing off photos from his honeymoon, a 2-week European cruise with luxury suites, champagne dinners, private tours, the whole damn fantasy wrapped in a $1,000 travel package. He was thanking our parents again for making it all possible, for paying in full, for gifting him the experience of a lifetime. "We never could have done it without you," he said, raising his glass in a lazy toast while our mother beamed with pride and our father chuckled like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I stood in the hallway, frozen, listening to them laugh, feeling something inside me snap so quietly, so precisely, it was almost surgical. They said they couldn't afford college, but they could afford Europe. They said there wasn't enough for both of us, but somehow there was always enough for him. It didn't happen all at once, that slow unraveling of trust and warmth, that quiet corrosion of what I used to believe family meant. It was gradual, subtle. Like water wearing down stone until one day you look around and realize you're standing in a canyon you never saw forming. After the honeymoon incident, I started noticing all the little things that used to slip past me, things I must have ignored or dismissed as coincidence when I was younger, still clinging to the naive idea that love was equal just because it was supposed to be. But once your eyes open, you can't unsee what was always there, hiding in plain sight beneath polite words and parental smiles. Jason kept getting handouts long after his wedding, and nobody even bothered to be discreet about it. A brand new car appeared in his driveway 6 months after his old one broke down. Not a used car or something practical, but a shiny, overpriced SUV with all the bells and whistles. The kind of car that screams middle-class status upgrade louder than a country club membership. My parents gave it to him as a gift for starting a family, though his wife wasn't even pregnant yet, and he'd just switched jobs again for the 3rd time in 2 years. When I asked about it, casually, cautiously, not even accusingly, my mother waved it off like it was no big deal. "We just wanted to give him a little boost," she said, like generosity had always flowed so freely from their hands. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But then came the down payment on his first house, another boost, another favor, another chunk of money that somehow materialized without struggle or hesitation. I had just finished paying off the last semester of my student loans at the time, and I remember sitting in my 1-bedroom rental with peeling paint and a faulty heater, wondering how it could be so easy for them to give everything to him while always insisting that I needed to earn mine. They never said it out loud, never used the words, but the message was clear in every gesture, every check written, every opportunity handed to him on a silver plate while I had to scrape mine together with duct tape and grit. I stopped visiting home as often after that. I made excuses about work, about distance, about needing time to focus on myself, but really I just couldn't stand the weight of pretending anymore. I couldn't sit at that dinner table and listen to them talk about Jason's promotions, his backyard renovations, his travel plans, all while they looked at me like I was still the responsible one, the independent one, the one who didn't need help or praise or support. I had become a convenient success story for them, a source of pride without cost, a trophy daughter who pulled herself up without making demands. But pride without presence feels hollow, and every pat on the back started to feel like a slap when it came wrapped in silence about all the years I had struggled alone. You ever realize your own family chose someone else over you, not with dramatic declarations or cruel insults, but with 1,000 quiet decisions that told you exactly where you stood? Not in words, but in actions that speak so loudly you still hear them echoing years later? Did you forgive them, or did you carry it quietly like a wound, hoping time would dull the sting even when you knew better? Let me know in the comments, because I still don't know which path hurts less. Still, I kept moving forward. I threw myself into my work, pushed harder than ever, chasing the kind of success that didn't rely on anyone's approval. I networked like hell, sent out resumes by the dozen, kept my head down and my ambition sharp. And finally, it paid off. I opened my inbox one morning to a message that made me stop breathing for a second. A job offer from a growing software firm I'd admired for years, offering me a full-time role with benefits, a solid salary, and room to grow. It wasn't just a job, it was a door, one I'd pried open with my own hands after being told there was nothing left for me. And this time, I was the one choosing who got to walk through it. There's a strange kind of satisfaction that comes from building something solid while no one's watching, from stacking bricks in the quiet while the world assumes you're still wandering aimlessly through some half-formed version of adulthood. I didn't make grand announcements or share celebratory posts online when I started climbing the ladder in my career, and not because I wasn't proud of the work. I just knew better than to offer anything up for judgment or comparison. After years of watching Jason's every mediocre achievement get paraded around like a golden trophy, I decided that silence would be my sanctuary, and my success would never be served to anyone who hadn't earned the right to witness it. The job offer turned out to be the first in a series of stepping stones that led me somewhere bigger, somewhere brighter, somewhere my parents never imagined I could reach without their help, and maybe that's what made it so damn satisfying. I worked long hours, poured myself into every project like it was my last chance to prove I belonged in rooms where decisions were made and money moved fast. I took on extra responsibilities, volunteered for tough assignments, and learned how to navigate office politics without ever compromising the fire that had carried me that far. Promotion followed promotion, and soon I was managing teams, overseeing clients, and getting invites to meetings that used to feel like glass ceilings I'd never be allowed to break. But through it all, I never called home to brag. I never sat across from my parents at the dinner table and listed my accomplishments the way Jason used to, casually slipping in job titles and new purchases like they were extensions of his ego. I didn't send photos of my new apartment or mention the bonuses I earned. I didn't even tell them when I bought my first car outright in cash, a practical but reliable sedan that I parked in a space paid for with money no one had handed to me. I didn't want their praise. I didn't need their recognition. I just wanted peace, and I'd learned the hard way that peace often comes with distance. When I finally saved enough for a down payment on a modest house, nothing extravagant, just a two-bedroom place with a backyard and a sunlit office where I could work uninterrupted, I signed the papers quietly and moved in without telling a soul in my family. It wasn't spite, not exactly. It was self-preservation. I didn't want them bringing their expectations, their comments, their comparisons into the space I'd built for myself. I didn't want to hear my mother suggesting paint colors or my father asking whether the neighborhood was safe enough. I wanted to walk through my front door every night knowing every tile, every fixture, every detail was mine, not something gifted, not something borrowed, not something earned through appeasement or good behavior. I kept my life private, tucked away behind professional walls and the kind of polite updates that never revealed too much. When my mother asked how work was, I said, busy but good. When my father asked if I needed anything, I thanked him and said I was managing just fine. I let them believe I was doing okay, but not exceptional. I let them think I was getting by, not thriving. And in a strange way, it was easier that way. They didn't ask too many questions, and I didn't offer too many answers. We stayed in this polite limbo where no one had to admit how far I'd come without them. I stopped checking Jason's updates online, stopped measuring my life against the one they helped him build. I didn't need to know how many vacations he was taking or how many times he changed jobs again without consequence. I had stopped keeping score. Or at least, I wanted to believe I had. But the truth was, that scoreboard still flickered somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet reminder of every time I'd been told there wasn't enough, every moment I'd been expected to understand why he deserved more while I was told to be grateful for less. So when the phone rang late one evening and I saw my mother's name on the screen, my stomach knotted without warning. We hadn't spoken in a while, just a few brief check-ins, nothing meaningful. I almost let it go to voicemail, almost convinced myself it was just another harmless call about the weather or a neighbor's gossip. But something about the timing, something about the way her name looked on the screen, made me pick it up. Her voice was softer than usual, almost shaky, like she was trying to keep something buried beneath casual pleasantries. She asked how I was, made a few comments about how quiet things had been lately, then hesitated just long enough for the silence to grow heavy. And then she said it, carefully, like she was tiptoeing towards something she didn't want to admit. We were wondering, she said slowly, if we could come by sometime soon, maybe visit for a bit. There was no reason for it, no birthday, no holiday, no special occasion, just that vague, uneasy request hanging in the air between us. And I knew right then, something was coming. Something they didn't want to say over the phone. When they pulled into my driveway that Sunday afternoon, I stood by the window and watched them get out of the car like strangers stepping into unfamiliar territory, their movements stiff and too rehearsed, as if they had practiced how casual they were supposed to appear. My mother stepped out first, clutching a casserole dish like it was a peace offering wrapped in melted cheese and nostalgia, while my father followed behind her with that same old forced smile he used when he didn't want to show how uncomfortable he really was. It had been years since either of them had been invited to anything in my life, let alone into my home, and I could feel the air around the front porch tighten the second they rang the bell. I opened the door, greeted them politely, even forced a smile, but inside, I could already feel the tension humming just beneath the surface of my skin. There's something hollow about pretending you're all just catching up when you know damn well there's a reason they're suddenly interested in being close again. They complimented my house in that overly enthusiastic way people do when they're trying to make up for something without actually acknowledging it. My mother gushed over the curtains, the backsplash, the open feel of the floor plan, while my father nodded along, occasionally muttering phrases like, "You've done well for yourself," as if it was some minor surprise that I hadn't ended up destitute without their help. I played the gracious host, offered them tea, set the table, and kept my tone light even though my gut was already bracing for the real conversation, the one I knew was coming the second my mother's voice cracked on the phone days earlier. We made small talk over dinner, mostly about nothing, how the neighborhood had changed, what their old neighbors were up to, how quiet things had been lately on their end. My mother kept darting glances toward my kitchen like she was trying to calculate how much I'd spent on the appliances, while my father focused more on his plate than on what anyone was saying. Eventually, though, the pleasantries started to fray at the edges, and the weight of whatever they had come to say began to show in their posture, their pauses, their shallow attempts at humor that never quite landed. It was my mother who finally broke the silence, setting down her fork with a clatter and folding her hands like she was preparing to deliver a eulogy rather than a request. She started slowly, talking about the economy, about how things had taken a turn they hadn't expected, how retirement hadn't gone the way they had planned. My father chimed in about a few investments that didn't pan out, which I immediately translated in my head as, "We lost everything and we're too proud to say it outright." Then came the part one had been waiting for the moment they looked at me, not as their independent daughter who had managed just fine without them, but as the last possible solution to a problem they could no longer solve on their own. My mother's voice got softer, her eyes more pleading, as she mentioned how hard it was to keep up with their bills, how the house was too much to manage, how they'd considered downsizing, but didn't want to burden anyone else. My father kept nodding, his fingers tapping nervously against the table, his gaze flickering toward me every few seconds, searching for any sign of how I might respond. I didn't say much. I just listened, my face blank, my heart steady, because I'd been preparing for this moment since the day I found out they paid for Jason's honeymoon while telling me there wasn't enough for my education. I kept my tone calm, kept my hands still, kept my expression unreadable, but inside, 1,000 thoughts were crashing against each other like waves, memories of every sleepless night I'd worked 2 jobs, every loan statement I'd cried over, every cheap meal I'd eaten in silence while they were handing my brother another check without blinking. Then, just when I thought they might finally ask me directly, finally say the words, "Can you help us?" my father leaned back in his chair and smiled in a way that almost made my skin crawl. "We always knew you'd do well," he said, like it was some kind of compliment, some consolation prize for all the years they'd looked the other way. "You're strong, Emily. That's why we didn't worry about you." And just like that, everything snapped into focus, not just the years of imbalance, not just the betrayal, but the underlying truth they had never said out loud before. It wasn't that they couldn't help me, they just chose not to. Because they thought I could survive without them, and they were right. But now, they needed me to survive. And suddenly, strength wasn't just something they admired, it was something they wanted to borrow. I don't know exactly when the plan began to take shape in my head, but by the time I called and invited my parents back for another dinner, it was already fully formed. Every word I would say, every pause I would take, every subtle inflection of tone that would disguise cold truth beneath calm civility. It wasn't rage that drove me, not anymore. It was something quieter, sharper, and far more deliberate than anger ever could be. I wanted them to feel what I had felt for years, not through cruelty or theatrics, but through a mirror held gently to their faces, one that would show them the weight of their choices with perfect clarity. They arrived a few days later, dressed just a bit more polished than last time, like they thought presentation might influence the outcome. My mother brought another dish, her hands fluttering as she set it down on the counter, trying to appear comfortable while clearly scanning for signs of how open I might be, signs of whether I had softened. My father was quieter than usual, his polite greeting stiff around the edges, as if he too sensed that this wasn't just another pleasant evening of idle conversation and lukewarm tea. I kept everything perfectly civil. I prepared a warm meal, set the table with cloth napkins and real silverware, lit candles that made the room feel cozy instead of confrontational. I poured them wine, asked about their week, kept my tone measured and polite. For a moment, I think they believed it would be easy, that their previous visit had worked its charm, that I'd been reminded of my duty, of my roots, of the obligation daughters are supposed to carry without complaint. But as dinner wore on, I started steering the conversation, slowly at first, gently nudging it from memories to milestones, from shared history to old decisions. I mentioned college, not bitterly, just offhandedly, like someone reflecting without resentment. I talked about the nights I spent working graveyard shifts while trying to study for finals, about eating peanut butter on saltines when I couldn't afford groceries, about skipping doctor visits because copays felt like luxuries back then. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, offering a weak smile and murmuring something vague about how hard those years must have been. I nodded. Then I paused. "Do you remember," I asked, voice low and even, "when you told me you couldn't afford to help with college?" My mother blinked slowly, caught between guilt and confusion, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to reach for a softer version of that memory, one that might make her look less harsh in hindsight. "You said, you'll find a way," I continued, my eyes never leaving hers. "I've never forgotten those words. You said I was strong, capable, independent, and that's why you didn't worry about me." My father cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable now, his fingers tapping against his glass like he was trying to summon a distraction. "But now," I said, keeping my voice just as calm, "it seems you're the ones who need help. And I'm sure you'll understand when I say, I can't afford to." The silence hit the table like a dropped plate, sharp and immediate. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and clattered against her plate. My father's mouth opened, then closed again, like the words had escaped him entirely. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands gently on the table, and added, "But Jason's doing fine, isn't he? Maybe he can help." That sentence hung in the air like smoke, soft, lingering, impossible to ignore. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let any venom slip through, but it landed with a weight far heavier than shouting ever could have. I had repeated their own logic, their own justification, with the same cold detachment they'd once used on me. I wanted them to hear it the way I had once heard it, not as a cruel rejection, but as a casual dismissal so deep it could split a soul in two. My mother started crying, not sobbing, just a quiet, breathless kind of weeping that came from a place deeper than she probably knew existed. My father stayed silent, staring down at his plate, his face a tight mask of shame and something else I couldn't quite place, maybe regret, maybe disbelief, maybe just the slow realization that the balance of power had shifted and wasn't coming back. I didn't gloat. I didn't twist the knife. I stood up slowly, walked into the hallway, and returned with a small envelope, plain, unmarked, neatly sealed. As I walked them to the door, my mother still dabbing her eyes with a napkin, I handed it to my father without explanation. "Just something to remember this by," I said softly, not unkindly, but with the same steady detachment they had once offered me in the form of empty words and empty hands. They looked down at it, unsure whether to open it there or later. But either way, it didn't really matter. Because nothing inside that envelope could ever cut as deep as the truth they'd just been forced to swallow. They didn't open the envelope right there on the porch, though I could tell by the way my father weighed it in his hand that he was trying to guess what might be inside, some explanation, some olive branch. Maybe even a check large enough to fix their crumbling situation and patch over the uncomfortable conversation we'd just had. But I didn't say another word as I closed the door gently behind them, locking it with the same quiet finality I'd learned to use on every part of my life they once had a hand in but no longer owned. I stood by the window as they walked to the car, watching their silhouettes through the glass, their shoulders slouched a little more than when they'd arrived, their silence heavy even from a distance. They didn't look back. They just drove away, and I stood there until the taillights vanished down the street. Later that night, I imagined them opening the envelope, probably in their kitchen, probably with matching expressions of confusion when they saw what was inside. A single check, modest in value, nothing close to what they were probably hoping for. It wasn't enough to solve their problems, not even close, but it was enough to make a point. Tucked beneath the check was a note, typed neatly on plain white paper, with just one line printed in black ink. "Consider it a taste of the help you gave me." And under that, in smaller print, a single word, compassion, followed by, not obligation. I didn't send it to humiliate them. I didn't send it to mock their desperation. I sent it because I needed them to understand that just because I had the power to be generous didn't mean I owed them a damn thing. Not forgiveness, not comfort, not reparations for the life they'd chosen to invest elsewhere while expecting me to shoulder everything on my own. That check was symbolic, a quiet reversal of the logic they'd lived by for decades, the logic that said you support the child who needs you least while lavishing everything on the one who needs you most, because in their eyes, love was measured by attention, and attention was reserved for those who demanded it loudest. A few days later, I met up with Sarah, one of the few people in my life who'd seen every version of me, from broke college student with a 1,000-yard stare to self-sufficient adult who still sometimes flinched when old wounds got too close to the surface. We were sitting on her back patio drinking tea, watching the evening light settle over the trees, when she finally looked at me and said, "That envelope thing, was it too cruel?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared into my cup, swirling the tea slowly, thinking about how strange it is that people only call something cruel when the victim is someone who used to have all the power. If I had broken down and handed them a blank check out of guilt, no one would have questioned it. No one would have asked if that was too generous. But show restraint, draw a boundary, offer a fraction of what you were once denied, and suddenly you're the villain in a story no one bothered to write your version of. "I don't know," I finally said, setting the cup down gently on the table. Maybe, but maybe not. Because the truth is, I hadn't done it purely out of spite. Something deeper had started stirring in me in the days after they left, a need to ensure that the cycle didn't continue, that this toxic ledger of favoritism and resentment didn't pass on to another generation like a poisoned inheritance wrapped in love and expectation. So I did something else. I set up a trust fund. Not for my parents, they'd already received all the compassion I could afford to spare. I created it for Jason's children, those two bright-eyed little kids who didn't choose the dysfunction they were born into, who had no idea that the adults around them were already shaping them in ways that would take years to untangle. It wasn't about rewarding Jason, it was about protecting the next branch on the family tree from growing in the same warped direction. I made sure the fund had strings attached, strict terms, educational use only, long-term access, accountability built into every layer. When Sarah asked me why I'd do that, why I'd give anything to a family that had offered me so little, I looked her in the eye and told her the truth. Because sometimes we give to the people who didn't deserve it, just so we don't become them. Or maybe I did it to sleep better at night. Either way, they'll remember what silence tastes like. And I finally got to choose who mattered. And that, more than anything else, felt like justice.